Elowen's head turned slowly. The loose board. Thalison set down his tools. He crossed the room and knelt down with the careful slowness of a man whose knees were no longer young. He lifted Balthazar gently and set him on the floor. Then he pulled at the edge of the board where the cat had been sitting. It came up easily, revealing a shallow cavity in the floor beneath. Inside lay a photograph in a small silver frame. Thalison lifted it out and handed it to her without speaking. Elowen took the photograph in both hands. She saw a young woman in a summer dress standing on a green lawn, her hair the color of wheat, her face turned slightly toward the camera as if she had just been called by name. Beside her stood another young woman, dark-haired, laughing. Both of them were holding a small grey kitten with honey-colored eyes. The kitten's tail had a crook at the end, exactly the same crook she now knew so well. The dark-haired young woman was Elowen herself. She was 30 years old in the picture. Her sister Marigold was 26. Elowen sat down heavily on a wooden stool. The photograph trembled in her hands. "I do not understand," she whispered. "I thought she was gone." Thalison sat down on the stool across from her. He folded his stained hands together in his lap. "She was gone, Elowen. She has been at rest for some time now. But before she went, she lived for 3 years in a small house in Tarrytown, only a few miles from here. And during those 3 years, the only living creature who kept her company was this cat." Elowen pressed her hand to her mouth. Balthazar walked over and pressed his head against her ankle. "She knew," Thalison said. "She knew the end was coming. She trained him. She fitted him with the harness. She put the key around his neck. And she let him go when she was ready, with instructions that he was to find his way home to you." "Why did she never come to me?" Elowen whispered. "Why did she let me believe she had been gone for so much longer?" Thalison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very gently, "Because of what happened between us, Elowen, all 3 of us, because of the words that were said in the autumn of 1994. She thought you would not want her. She was wrong. But by the time she understood she was wrong, she did not have time left to mend it herself, so she sent him." Elowen looked down at the brass key resting against the warm fur of Balthazar's chest. "And what does the key open?" she asked. Thalison smiled, just a little. "That is the question, and only Balthazar knows the answer. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to talk to you. YouTube has decided that our channel does not meet their requirements to be supported by their platform. We believe this is a mistake and we are fighting it. But right now, the only thing keeping Paws and Whispers alive is the love you have for these stories. If our videos have ever touched your heart, consider making a small donation. Even $1 helps us keep going. Just being here, watching and caring, already means the world to us. The donation link is pinned in the comments below. Thank you. Elowen spent the next 2 weeks in a state of quiet turmoil. The visit to the workshop had cracked something open inside her, something she had walled up for so long she had forgotten the wall was there. Each evening, after she had fed Balthazar and herself, she would sit by the fire with the photograph in her hands and trace the curve of her sister's smile with one careful finger. Marigold had been so young in the picture. 26. The age at which she had stormed out of the house on a windy October afternoon, slamming the door behind her after a quarrel with Elowen that had grown out of nothing and into everything. They had argued about Thalison in the end, about whether Marigold should marry him, about whether their father, on his sickbed, had been right to disapprove. Words had been said, old hurts had been dug up. By the time Elowen had calmed enough to want to apologize, Marigold had left the house, and a long, cold silence had begun between them, a silence that had stretched across decades and seemed for years to have no end. Marigold had moved away. Elowen had married Edgar. The years had passed, and eventually she had simply stopped knowing where her sister was and had told herself that this was the way of things, and had buried that small, unhealed wound deep beneath the larger griefs of an ordinary life. Now, sitting beside her radiator, with Balthazar curled against her hip, she understood that Marigold had been closer than she had ever known. Only a few miles down the river, living quietly, dying slowly, keeping company with a cat who had once been theirs both. Elowen pressed her face into her hands and wept for the first time in a long while. Not the dry, exhausted weeping of grief, but something gentler, something that left her feeling lighter when it had passed. It was on a clear, cold afternoon in late February that she finally telephoned Thalison. "I need to know what the key opens," she said, "and I cannot drive anymore. My eyes—" "I will drive you," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Be ready by 9. He arrived at 8:45 in an old green pickup truck with a heater that worked only on the highest setting and a radio that played only the static of distant stations. Elwyn climbed in carefully, holding Balthazar in his small wicker carrier. The cat looked through the wire mesh with calm curiosity, as if he had taken this drive 100 times before. They drove south along the river road. The Hudson, still partly frozen, glinted between the trees. Thalison did not speak much, and Elwyn was grateful. Some silences were the kind that needed filling. This one was not. After about 40 minutes, he turned off the main road and onto a narrow lane that wound between hills. They passed an old stone bridge, a closed roadside diner, a field with 3 brown horses standing close together against the cold. At last, they came to a small, abandoned railway station. Its red brick walls were patched with frost. Its windows were boarded. A faded sign above the door read, "Sleepy Hollow," with the dates of opening and closing carved underneath. The trains had stopped running through it many years ago. Thalison parked the truck. They walked together to the station door. It was locked, but Thalison pulled out a ring of keys from his coat pocket. "I have been the caretaker here for the Historical Society for almost 20 years, he said, by way of explanation. Marigold knew that. She always knew where to leave things she wanted kept safe. He opened the door. The air inside smelled of cold stone and old paper. Sunlight slanted in through cracks in the boarded windows. Rows of brass post office boxes lined one wall, 400 or so, each numbered, each with a small keyhole. The station had once doubled as a mail depot for the surrounding farms. Balthazar, released from his carrier, walked confidently across the dusty floor and stopped in front of box number 472. Elwyn knelt down. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the brass key into the lock. Thalison placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. She turned the key. The small door swung open. Inside lay a leather envelope, sealed with wax. She drew it out. She broke the seal. She unfolded the papers within. Her breath caught. The first document was a letter in Marigold's familiar handwriting, longer than the small note had been, dated 3 years earlier. The second document was an old yellowed deed, stamped and signed and notarized, dating back to 1967. It bore their father's signature. Elwyn read both. She read them again. Then she sat down on the cold floor of the railway station with the papers in her lap and looked up at Thalison. "The land," she whispered. "The land where the music school stands. Father left it to her. Not to the state, to Marigold, and she never told anyone." Thalison lowered himself beside her, slowly, his old knees popping. "She was protecting it from your father's debts at the time. She was going to come forward when things settled. But by then, the state had built the school, and she did not want to disturb it. She loved that school, Elwyn. She loved that children were learning music there. She just wanted you to have the deed when she was gone, so that no one could ever take the land for the wrong reasons." Elwyn pressed the deed to her chest. Outside, somewhere in the cold sky, a flock of crows passed overhead, their cries muffled by the empty walls. Balthazar walked into her lap and curled there, his small body warm against the papers. "There is something else," Thalison said quietly. "Read the letter to the end." Elwyn lifted the letter again. At the bottom of the final page, in handwriting that grew shakier as it went, Marigold had written, "Beware the woman who wants the land. She knew about the debt. She has been waiting for years. Do not let her win, Ellie. I am sorry I waited so long to send him home. Take care of him. He loves you. He always has." Elwyn looked at Thalison. "Keelani Thorne," she said. Thalison nodded. "I have suspected for a long time. Now we have proof." The cat in her lap purred, deep and steady, and somewhere outside, the cold wind rattled the old boards of the station like a hand knocking very gently on a long-closed door. The first thing Elwyn did when she got home was call her son Cassian in the city. Cassian Vance was 44 years old, a real estate attorney in Manhattan, a man who wore expensive shoes and worked late hours and had not been home for Thanksgiving in 3 years. He was a good man underneath, Elwyn knew, but life had pulled him in a direction she did not always recognize, and conversations with him often felt like they were happening through thick glass. "Mom, hi. Is everything okay? Cassian, I need you to come home this weekend. There is something I have to show you." There was a long pause. "Is it your health? Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine." But Balthazar came back. Another long pause. Balthazar, the cat. "Mom, that cat has been gone for years." He came back with a key, and the key opened a box at the old Sleepy Hollow station. And the box had your aunt's letter and a deed your grandfather signed in 1967. "Cassian, please, come home." She heard him exhale. She heard the small click of his fingers tapping against something hard, the way he had always done when he was thinking. Then, to her surprise, he said, "I will be there Saturday morning." He arrived in a black town car at 9 on Saturday. He was thinner than the last time she had seen him, with new grey streaks at his temples. He kissed her on the cheek and stepped into the front hall and stopped when he saw the grey cat sitting on the rug in front of the radiator. "Well, I'll be," Cassian said very softly. Balthazar walked over to him, stared up at him for a long moment, and then bumped the top of his head firmly against Cassian's ankle. Cassian knelt down. He held out his hand. Balthazar pressed his face into the palm and closed his eyes. Cassian's throat worked. He did not say anything for a while. Then he stood up, cleared his throat, and said, "Show me everything, Mom." She spread the papers on the kitchen table. The letter from Marigold, the deed from 1967. The photographs Thalison had given her of the workshop and the railway box. Cassian read everything carefully, the way only a lawyer reads, with a pen in his hand and a notepad at his elbow. When he finished, he looked up. His eyes were wet, though he would not have called it that. "Mom, this changes things. If this deed is authentic, and I have no reason to think it isn't, then the legal standing of the music school's land is unclear. The state may have built without proper title. And if Kailani Thorne knew about Aunt Marigold's debt and was using that as leverage to claim adjacent properties on the basis of fraudulent paperwork, then we have a case." "What kind of case?" "The kind that puts a stop to her plans. The kind that protects this house and the school and a lot of other things. But it would mean me getting publicly involved. It would mean me filing motions against a developer my own firm has done business with in the past. There are people in the city who will not be happy with me." Elowen looked at her son. She remembered the boy he had been, who had carried Balthazar as a kitten in the front of his sweatshirt all summer long. She remembered the teenager who had argued with her about everything. She remembered the young man who had walked her down the aisle at her second wedding to Edgar after his father had passed. "Cassian," she said softly, "I am not going to ask you to ruin yourself for me." He smiled, the lopsided smile she had not seen in years. "Mom, you are not asking. I am telling you. I'm doing this." He went home to the city that evening, but he was back within the week, this time with 3 boxes of files and a suitcase. He set up a temporary office in the dining room. He worked all day and into the evening, taking calls and writing motions, and at night he ate dinner with his mother at the kitchen table and asked her to tell him stories about Marigold that he had never heard. The first hearing was set for early April. The court calendar moved slowly, but Cassian moved faster. He had Thalison formally interviewed. He had the deed authenticated by a forensic expert. He filed a formal claim on behalf of his mother as Marigold's only living relative. Meanwhile, Kailani Thorne struck back. 2 days after Cassian filed his claim, a man in a brown coat appeared at Elowen's door with a court order. He explained politely but firmly that Miss Thorne had petitioned for the cat to be impounded as evidence in a dispute over property. He had come to collect the animal. Elowen looked at him. She looked at Balthazar, who was sitting on the windowsill watching the snow melt. "I am very sorry, young man," she said, "but I do not believe you are going to take that cat anywhere." Balthazar leapt from the windowsill, darted between the man's legs, and was out the open back door before anyone could move. By the time Elowen reached the porch, the grey streak of him was already vanishing into the woods at the edge of the property. "Oh dear," Elowen said, with what she hoped was sufficient innocence. "He seems to have run off. Cats are like that, you know." The man in the brown coat stared at her. Then he turned and walked back to his car. When she closed the door, she leaned her back against it and laughed for the first time in a very long while. Then her laughter faded, and she looked toward the woods, and she thought, "Oh, Balthazar, please be careful. Please come home again." He was gone for 2 days. On the third morning, Cassian got a phone call from a sheriff in the next county. A grey cat with a leather harness had been found sitting on the front steps of the abandoned Sleepy Hollow railway station, refusing to move, hissing at 2 men in dark coats who had been trying to break the lock on the door. The 2 men had fled when the sheriff arrived. The cat had allowed himself to be picked up very carefully. When Cassian drove down to retrieve him, Balthazar was sitting in a blanket on the sheriff's desk, drinking water from a paper cup, looking deeply pleased with himself. The court proceedings dragged through the spring and into the early days of summer. Cassian commuted between the city and Everett Park, growing more tired and more determined with each trip. Elowen made him sandwiches she pressed into his hands as he was rushing out the door, and she folded laundry while he made phone calls, and she watered the herbs on the back porch in the early mornings when the dew still lay on the basil leaves. Balthazar, fully recovered now, had taken to following her around the yard with great interest, sniffing at the tomato plants and batting at the moths that drifted up from the lavender. He had grown stronger. His fur, once patchy, now had its old softness back. His eyes shone. He had begun, in the evenings, to perform small acts of mischief that filled the house with the lightness of laughter. He stole a slipper. He pushed a pencil off the kitchen table and watched it roll. He sat on top of Cassian's open briefcase and refused to move, no matter how politely Cassian asked. "He is a menace," Cassian said one evening, lifting Balthazar gently off a stack of legal briefs. "He is a hero," Elowen corrected, handing her son a cup of tea. "He can be both," Cassian conceded. In late June, the court hearing was held at the county courthouse. Elowen wore her good grey dress and a brooch that had belonged to her mother. Thalison came in a clean white shirt and his only tie, which was 20 years out of date. Hattie sat in the gallery with her hands clasped in her lap. Cassian wore a navy suit and stood at the table with the air of a man who had not lost a case in 5 years. Keelani Thorne sat across the aisle with 2 attorneys and a face like cut glass. Cassian presented the deed. He presented the letter. He presented the testimony from a handwriting expert and a forensic accountant who had traced the false paperwork Keelani's firm had submitted to the county clerk. The pattern was clear. Documents had been altered. Signatures had been forged. The trail led, through 3 shell companies, directly back to Keelani Thorne. The judge, a quiet older woman with a Brooklyn accent, listened patiently to it all. She asked 1 or 2 careful questions. She read the original deed from 1967, holding it up to the light. Then she set it down and folded her hands. "This is a sad case," the judge said, "and I am going to make some short rulings. The deed presented by Mr. Vance is authentic and binding. The plaintiff's claim against Mrs. Vance's property is dismissed with prejudice. The matter of the forged documents will be referred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Miss Thorne, you will surrender your business license for the duration of that investigation. We are adjourned." The gavel came down. Hattie squeezed Elowen's hand so hard that Elowen had to laugh in spite of herself. That night, they all came back to the house for dinner. Hattie brought a pie. Thalison brought a bottle of sparkling cider, which he poured into Elowen's mother's good crystal glasses with shaking hands. Cassian carried Balthazar into the kitchen in his arms and set the cat down on a chair at the table as if he were a guest of honor. The kitchen smelled of roast chicken and rosemary. The lamp above the table cast a warm gold light on all of their faces. For the first time in many years, Elowen looked around her own kitchen and saw it full of people who loved her. She raised her glass. "To Marigold," she said softly. "To Marigold," they echoed. Balthazar, on his chair, blinked his slow, honey-colored blink, and the silver bell on his harness, which Thalison had added that afternoon in memory of the church bell he had been trained to listen for, tinkled softly. It was a good evening. It was the kind of evening Elowen had stopped believing she would ever have again. And as she lay in bed that night, with Balthazar curled at her feet, she thought of all the years she had spent listening to the silence of her house, and she thought of how, sometimes, the quietest doors can open onto the brightest rooms. But there was still one thing she did not understand, one question that had been turning in her mind for months. Why had Marigold told her all those years ago that she was gone forever? Why had she let Elowen grieve when she had been only a few miles down the river? What had really been said in the autumn of 1994 that had cost them both so many years? She turned that question over and over in her mind until at last she fell asleep, with Balthazar's steady breathing as her only answer. The answer came in the early autumn, when the maples along Birch Street had turned the color of fire and the air smelled of wood smoke and ripening apples. Thalison came over for tea on a Tuesday afternoon. He had been visiting more often that summer, sometimes to bring her vegetables from his garden, sometimes to repair some small thing around the house that had been broken for years, sometimes just to sit on the back porch with her and watch Balthazar stalk the imaginary mice in the lavender bushes. Elowen had grown used to his quiet presence in a way that surprised her. They were old now, both of them, and the words that had once stood between them had long since lost their sharp edges. On this particular Tuesday, he brought with him a small wooden box. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at her for a moment before opening it. "Marigold left some things with me, Elowen, before the end. She asked me to give them to you when you were ready. I think today is the day." Elowen sat very still. She nodded. He opened the box. Inside lay a small brown notebook, several letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and a tiny silver bell on a leather cord. "Read the top letter first," Thalison said gently. She lifted it. The handwriting was Marigold's, neater than it had been at the end, the careful hand of a woman in her middle years. "Dear Ellie, I have been trying to write this letter for 10 years. I am not sure I will ever finish it. But if you are reading these words, then I am not here anymore, and Balthazar has done what I asked him to do, and you have found me at last, through him. You should know that the words I said to you on that October afternoon were not the words I meant. I was angry, and I was young, and I was frightened of what Father had said on his sickbed, and I took it all out on you because you were the strongest person I knew, and I believed you could bear it. I should not have walked out. I should have come back the next day. But pride is a heavy stone, Ellie, and the longer we carry it, the harder it is to set down. I carried it for a long time. By the time I was ready to set it down, you had married Edgar, and I had moved to Tarrytown, and I told myself you had a new life and would not want me in it. That was the second mistake. The first mistake was leaving. The second was believing my own excuses. When I got sick 3 years ago, I knew I did not have time to mend it the way it should be mended. So I did what I could. I cared for Balthazar, who had wandered into my garden one cold morning, half frozen and starving, 4 winters before you read this. I knew at once that he was yours. I had heard, through people who knew people, that your cat had gone missing the year before. I think he was trying to find you all that time, and somehow he found me instead, and I did not have the heart to send him on his way until I was ready to send him home with everything you needed. I trained him with the bell, Ellie, the little silver bell I have left in this box. Every night for 3 years, I rang it at sundown and gave him his supper. I rang it at the open window. I rang it on long walks. I rang it so that the sound would live inside him, and so that one day, when he heard the bells of St. Bridget's ringing across the river, he would know which way home was. I have left you the deed. I have left you the truth about Keelani Thorne, who is the granddaughter of a man Father once owed money to, and who has been waiting all her adult life to take what she believes she is owed. I have left you the letter that I should have written 40 years ago. Forgive me, Ellie, and forgive Thalison too. He was never the cause of our quarrel. He was only its excuse. He has been a good and quiet friend to me all these years, and he has been faithful in keeping my secrets and in carrying out my requests. He deserves your kindness now. I love you. I have always loved you. The cat is proof of that, if nothing else is. He carries my love in his harness, and he carries it across the snow, and he lays it down on your back porch on a November morning, and now, at last, you are holding it in your hands. Take care of him, Ellie. He has earned his rest. All my love, always. Your sister Marigold. Elowen lowered the letter to the table. She did not cry. She had cried for many years, and now somehow she was past crying. She felt instead a deep, warm settling, as if some great heavy thing inside her chest had finally found its proper place and lain down. Thalison reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were rough and warm. "She was a good woman, Elowen," he said softly. "She was a stubborn woman like her sister, but she was good. I should have gone after her, Elowen whispered, and she should have come back. You were both children in your way. Now you are not. Elowen looked up at him. She had not really looked at him in many years, not the way she did now. His face was lined and tired, but his pale blue eyes were the same eyes she had known when she was 25 years old, and they were looking at her with the same patient kindness they had always held. Thalison, she said, I am sorry too, for everything I said, for all the years. 1,000 we crows. He squeezed her hand. We have time now. Not as much as we once had, but enough. Balthazar, who had been sitting on the windowsill listening to all of this with the serious attention cats reserve for moments they cannot understand but know to honor, jumped down and walked across the kitchen floor. He came to Elowen's chair. He stretched up and placed both front paws on her knee, looking up at her with the steady, honey eyes of a creature who had walked many miles for this one moment. Elowen lifted him gently into her lap. The silver bell on his harness chimed softly. Outside the kitchen window, the bells of St. Bridget's Church began to ring the 4 o'clock hour, and Balthazar lifted his head and listened, and Elowen pressed her face into his soft grey fur and breathed. She did not need to ask why he had come home now, after all those years. She knew now. He had come home because Marigold had finally been ready to send him. The first weekend of October brought the Everett Park Harvest Festival, the way it had every year for as long as anyone could remember. The town square filled with stalls selling cider donuts and pumpkin bread, with tables covered in jars of honey and apple butter and quilts made by the women's circle at the church. A string quartet from the music school played softly under a yellow tent. Children ran between the stalls with their faces painted like foxes and cats, and the great gold sunflowers their grandmothers grew along the back fences. Elowen had not gone to the festival in 7 years. She had not gone because Edgar had been the one who loved it, who lit up at the small-town fuss of it, who had always insisted they buy too many donuts and too much cider and bring home jars of jam they did not need. Without him, the festival had felt like another doorway she could not bring herself to walk through. But this year, she went. Cassian drove her. He had taken 3 days off from the city, and he had brought in the back seat of his car a small wicker carrier with Balthazar inside. Thalison met them in the square. Hattie was already there, presiding over a table selling her famous lemon bars. Dr. Whitfield, the veterinarian, waved from the stall where the local animal shelter was raising money for winter supplies. Elowen walked slowly through the crowd, her hand resting on Cassian's arm, and the people of Everett Park stopped her at every turn. They had heard about the cat. They had heard about the deed. They had heard about Kaylani Thorne, who had quietly left town 2 weeks earlier, her business license suspended pending the criminal investigation. They wanted to shake Elowen's hand. They wanted to tell her how glad they were. They wanted to bend down and look at the grey cat in the carrier and say hello, very politely, as if to a visiting dignitary. Balthazar bore it all with regal patience. He allowed himself to be admired. He blinked his slow blinks at the children who whispered to him through the wire mesh. He purred when Hattie reached in and stroked his head. He was, Elowen thought, enjoying himself enormously in the way that only cats can enjoy attention they pretend not to need. Late in the afternoon, when the sun had begun to slant low and golden through the maples, Elowen sat on a bench beside the bandstand with Balthazar in her lap. Cassian had gone to fetch her a cup of warm cider. Thalison sat beside her. Together, they watched a small girl in a red coat chase a pinwheel across the grass. "Elowen," Thalison said quietly, "I think it is time." She looked down at the cat in her lap. The leather harness lay against his soft fur, the brass key catching the last of the sun. The orchid petal in its glass shell glowed faintly, the way it had the first morning she had seen him on her back porch. She reached down with both hands. Balthazar looked up at her. He did not hiss. He did not pull away. He met her eyes with the deep, steady, honey gaze of a creature who had finished a long task and was, at last, ready to set it down. Slowly, gently, she unbuckled the harness. The leather slid free. The brass key and the glass pendant lay in her open palm, warm from his body. Balthazar stretched, long and luxurious, then settled back into her lap with a small sigh of contentment. Elowen lifted the harness and held it up to the light. She turned the glass pendant in her fingers, and the orchid petal inside seemed to drift like a tiny boat on a still sea. "He kept this safe for so long," she whispered. "He kept it safe because he loved her," Thalison said. "And because he loves you." Cassian returned with the cider. He sat down on her other side. The three of them sat quietly on the bench as the festival hummed around them, and the bells of St. Bridget's began to ring the 5 o'clock hour, and Balthazar, in Eloan's lap, lifted his head, listened for a long moment, and then lay back down. He had heard the bells. He had come home. He did not need them to bring him anywhere anymore. That evening, Eloan took the brass key and the glass pendant and the leather harness and placed them carefully inside the small wooden box that Thalison had brought her, beside Marigold's letters and the silver bell. She placed the box on the mantelpiece in the living room, where it would catch the light each morning when the sun rose over the back garden. She fed Balthazar a small dish of warm chicken. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea. She sat down in her old armchair by the radiator, and Balthazar jumped into her lap and curled there, and the orange light of the setting sun streamed through the stained glass panel above the front door, the one Edgar had bought for her 30 years ago at an estate sale, and it fell across the floor in soft amber pools. She thought of all the things she had learned in the year since the cat had come home. She had learned that time does not only heal wounds. Sometimes time reveals truths that pride has tried very hard to hide. She had learned that grief is not a door that locks behind you. She had learned that a cat can walk through snow and ice and forests and over rivers for years, carrying a small key and a glass pendant, and that the reasons he does this are reasons no human will ever fully understand, but the love of which they are made is a love we can recognize. She had learned that her sister had loved her until the end. She had learned that her son had been waiting all this time for a reason to come home. She had learned that a quiet man in a workshop at the edge of the woods could become, slowly, gently, after many years, a friend again. She had learned that no one is ever truly invisible as long as there is one brave heart willing to cross many miles of snow for a promise. Balthazar purred against her chest, his small body rising and falling with the easy breath of a creature at rest. The sun continued to fall through the stained glass. Somewhere in the kitchen, the clock that had once belonged to Edgar ticked on, marking the seconds of a quiet evening at home. Eloan closed her eyes. She smiled. The house was no longer silent. The house was full. It had been full all along, she understood now, with the love of those who had come and gone, and the love of those who had returned, and the warm grey weight of a cat who had remembered, against all the odds, the way back to her door. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear above the rooftops of Everett Park. The bells of St. Bridget's rang the 6 o'clock hour. Balthazar, in her lap, did not stir. He was home. They all were. And somewhere, Eloan knew, her sister Marigold was smiling too. Before we start, I want to share a heartfelt thank you to those who have sent a donation to our channel. Your kindness truly keeps this little corner of ours alive. If you'd like to support our work too, you can find the link in the first comment. Blessings to you all, and let's get ready for today's story. The first snowfall of November had settled over Everett Park during the night, the kind of soft, patient snow that seemed to hush the entire valley of the Hudson River into a long, gentle pause. Eloan Vance stood at her kitchen window, wrapping her thin hands around a porcelain teacup that had once belonged to her mother, watching the steam rise and curl against the cold glass. She was 68 years old, though some mornings she felt closer to 100, and the silence of her house had become a companion she neither welcomed nor knew how to send away. The kettle ticked as it cooled. The grandfather clock in the hallway, the one her late husband Edgar had wound every Sunday for 43 years, marked the seconds with a steady tock that seemed louder now that no one else was there to hear it. Eloan took a slow sip of her chamomile tea, closed her eyes, and listened to the small sounds of an empty home. The radiator hissed. A loose shutter on the second floor tapped against the wooden siding. Somewhere outside, a cardinal called once and then fell quiet. It had been exactly 4 years since Balthazar had vanished. She did not need a calendar to count the days, because grief had a way of keeping its own ledger. 1,460 mornings of glancing toward the back porch and finding no grey cat waiting on the welcome mat. 1,460 evenings of setting down a single bowl of food, then remembering, then putting the bowl back in the cupboard. The shape of his absence had worn itself into the rhythm of her days, the way a river wears a groove into stone. Elowyn set her teacup down on the saucer with a small clink and turned toward the back door. She always opened it once each morning, just to feel the cold air on her face and to look at the garden where she had once planted tulips with her sister Marigold. It was a habit, nothing more, a small ritual that kept her tethered to the world outside her walls. She turned the brass knob, pulled the door open, and froze. There, on the snow-dusted wooden boards of the back porch, sat a cat with storm-colored fur and eyes the color of warm honey. He was thinner than she remembered, with patches of fur missing along his flank and a small notch in his left ear that had not been there before. But the way he held his head, regal and unhurried, and the way his tail curled neatly around his front paws, as if he had been waiting for hours and intended to wait for hours more if necessary, was unmistakable. The sound that left Elowyn's throat was not a cry. It was a thin, trembling exhale, the kind of sound a person makes when they have forgotten how to breathe and must teach themselves all over again. Her teacup, which she had somehow brought with her to the door without realizing, slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor behind her. She did not look down. She could not look away. "Balthazar," she whispered. The cat blinked once, slowly, in that ancient feline gesture that means hello, and I have missed you, and I have things to tell you that you will not believe. It was then that Elowyn noticed the weight around his neck. Strapped across his thin chest was a small leather harness, hand-stitched and worn smooth by what looked like years of wear. Two objects hung from the harness. The first was a brass key, numbered with the digits 4, 7, and 2, polished as if someone had taken great care to keep it bright. The second was a thick glass pendant the size of a walnut, inside of which floated a single dried orchid petal, pale lavender, perfectly preserved. Elowyn knelt down slowly, her knees protesting against the cold floor, and reached out a trembling hand. Balthazar watched her approach with grave attention. When her fingertips were inches from the harness, he made a low sound deep in his throat, not a growl exactly, but a warning, a sibilant breath that said, "These things are not yours to touch yet." She drew her hand back. He stood, stretched his thin body, and walked past her into the kitchen as if he had only been gone for an afternoon. Elowyn remained kneeling in the doorway, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her temples. The snow continued to fall. Somewhere down the street, the bells of St. Bridget's Church began to ring the 9 o'clock hour, and Balthazar, halfway across the kitchen floor, stopped and turned his head toward the sound as if it were a voice calling him by name. What had he carried home? And who, in all the long years of his absence, had taught him to listen for bells? For the first 3 days after Balthazar's return, Elowyn did almost nothing but watch him. She moved through her house with the careful quiet of a woman afraid of breaking a spell, refilling his water bowl, warming small portions of chicken broth on the stove, and sitting in her old armchair with a book she did not read. The cat ate sparingly. He drank cautiously. He slept in long, deep stretches on the braided rug in front of the radiator, and even in sleep he kept the harness on. She had tried, gently, twice more to remove it. Each time, Balthazar woke and made the same low warning sound, and each time she had withdrawn her hand and apologized to him in a soft voice, as if he were a man recovering from a long illness who needed his pride respected. The brass key and the glass pendant rose and fell with his breathing, and Elowyn began to feel that the harness was not a burden he wore, but a duty he carried, and that he would not give it up until the duty was done. On the 4th morning, her neighbour Hattie Burnham came over with a tin of oatmeal raisin cookies and the determined expression of a woman who has decided that something must be discussed. Hattie was 72, a retired schoolteacher with a soft Virginia accent that had never quite faded, and she had been Elowyn's friend for nearly 50 years. "Elowyn, honey, I heard from Marcy at the post office that you've been keeping a cat in the house," Hattie said, setting the cookies on the kitchen table and unbuttoning her wool coat. "And Marcy heard from Donald next door, and Donald said it looks like that old grey fellow you used to have. Now I told them all that couldn't possibly be, because that was 4 winters ago, but I had to come see for myself. Elowen poured 2 cups of tea without speaking. She set the sugar bowl between them, the chipped one with the painted forget-me-nots, and then she gestured toward the rug in front of the radiator. Balthazar lifted his head, regarded Hattie with the cool appraisal of a customs officer reviewing a passport, and then settled back down. Hattie pressed her hand against her mouth. "Oh, Elowen. Oh, my stars." "It's him," Elowen said quietly. "I know it's him. He has the white patch on his chin and the little crook at the end of his tail. But how?" Hattie sank into a kitchen chair. 4 years, sweetheart. Where on earth has he been?" Elowen reached for her teacup. Her hand was steadier now than it had been on that first morning, but only just. "I don't know. But he came back wearing something. A harness, with a key and a little glass pendant, and he won't let me take it off." Hattie set down her tea so abruptly it sloshed onto the saucer. She leaned forward. "A key? What kind of key?" "Brass. Numbered. 472. The 2 women sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, a snowplow rumbled down the street, its yellow light flashing through the lace curtains. Hattie pursed her lips, the way she always did when she was thinking carefully. "Elowen, I don't want to upset you, but I have to tell you what's being said around town." "Then tell me." "Keelani Thorne has been talking, loud, the way she does. She's saying you've been seeing things, that the cat is a stray you've taken in, and that you've gotten confused about who he is. She's saying it could be a public health concern. She's been at the town hall twice this week." Elowen's jaw tightened just slightly. She knew Keelani Thorne well enough. The woman had bought the old Hennessy property 2 years ago, torn down the farmhouse, and put up 6 identical brick boxes she called luxury townhomes. She had been making offers on Elowen's land for over a year, and the offers had grown more aggressive each time Elowen declined. "She wants my house, Hattie. She has wanted it for a long while. Now she has decided to want my mind too." Hattie reached across the table and took Elowen's hand. Her fingers were warm from the teacup. "Then we don't let her have either. But Elowen, you need to think about that key. Whatever Balthazar has been carrying, somebody put it on him. Somebody who knew him, somebody who maybe knew you." Elowen looked down at the cat. He had opened one honey-colored eye and was watching her with what she could only describe as expectation. The orchid petal in its glass shell caught the morning light and glowed faintly, like a candle behind frosted paper. "There were initials on the harness," she said slowly. "I saw them yesterday when he stretched. 2 letters burned into the leather. T and C." Hattie's eyes widened. "Thalison Crane." The name landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water, spreading rings outward through the quiet. Elowen had not spoken that name aloud in over 30 years. She had hoped, foolishly, that she might never have to speak it again. "I haven't talked to that man since the autumn of 1994, Elowen whispered. "Well, sweetheart," Hattie said softly, squeezing her hand, "it looks like your cat has gone and made the introduction for you." That night, Elowen sat by the fireplace with Balthazar on her lap for the first time in 4 years. His weight against her thighs was lighter than she remembered. She could feel the small bones of his shoulders through his fur, and the steady, deep rumble of his purring filled the silent room like a song that had been waiting for someone to come home and hum it. She did not sleep well. In her dreams, she was young again, and her sister Marigold was laughing in the next room, and somewhere a bell was ringing, ringing, ringing. The pneumonia came on the 7th day. Elowen noticed it first in the way Balthazar's breathing changed during the night. By morning, his small body was hot to the touch, and a rattling sound came from his chest each time he exhaled. He had stopped eating the night before, and now he could barely lift his head from the rug. Elowen wrapped him in her softest wool blanket, the one Marigold had knitted for her one Christmas long ago, and she did something she had not done in years. She picked up the telephone in the front hall, the one with the long curly cord, and she called for a taxi. Her old station wagon had been sitting in the garage for nearly a year now, gathering dust, because her eyes were no longer steady enough for the road, especially in the winter. The veterinary clinic on Maple Street smelled of disinfectant and the faint sweetness of dog food. Dr. Imani Whitfield, a kind woman in her 40s with silver-streaked braids and gentle hands, examined Balthazar with patient care. She listened to his chest for a long time, and when she finally lowered her stethoscope, her expression was grave, but not without hope. He is very weak, Mrs. Vance. Severe pneumonia. He has clearly been on a long journey, and his body has paid for it. I can treat him, but it will require a hospital stay of at least a week, and the medication is not inexpensive. How much? Elowen asked. Dr. Whitfield named a figure that made Elowen's hands go still in her lap. It was nearly 3 months of her pension. She thought of the savings account that had thinned to almost nothing after Edgar's long illness. She thought of the property tax bill coming in January. Then she looked at Balthazar, wrapped in the blue wool blanket, his honey eyes half closed, the brass key rising and falling with his shallow breathing. "I will pay it," she said. "I have something I can sell." She went home that evening alone for the first time in a week. The house felt enormous and empty without him. She walked up the narrow staircase to her bedroom, opened the top drawer of the cherry wood dresser, and took out a small velvet box. Inside lay Edgar's gold pocket watch. He had bought it the year they were married, with the first real money he had ever earned, and he had carried it every day for 43 years. He had pressed it into her hand on the last morning of his life, and he had told her with great seriousness that she should not feel guilty about ever needing to part with it. She held the watch in her palm. It was warm from being near her heart. She closed her fingers around it and listened to the soft tick. "He came back to us, Edgar," she whispered to the empty room. "He came back, and he is sick, and he needs me. You would understand." The next morning, she took the watch to a small antique shop on Bridge Street, run by a man named Cassius Ardennes, who had known Edgar for many years and who handled her transaction with the careful respect that decent people show to grief. He gave her a fair price. She walked the 3 blocks to the bank, deposited the money, walked another 2 blocks to the veterinary clinic, and paid the bill in full. When she got home, the house was silent in a way she had not noticed in days. She had grown used to the small sounds of Balthazar, the soft thump of him jumping down from the windowsill, the click of his paws on the kitchen floor. Their absence pressed against her like cold air. She sat down at the kitchen table and lifted the leather harness, which she had finally been able to remove gently while Balthazar was sedated at the clinic. She turned it over in her hands. The leather was supple, oiled by what must have been countless careful applications over the years. And there, on the inside of the strap that had rested against his chest, were the initials, burned in with a hot tool by a craftsman who knew his trade. T.C. Thalison Crane had been a luthier, a maker of stringed instruments, before he had retreated into the wooded edge of town 3 decades ago. He lived in a small workshop near the old railway line, and he was known by everyone in Everett Park and spoken to by almost no one. He was the sort of man children invented stories about and adults politely avoided. He had also, once very long ago, been the dearest friend of Elowen's younger sister, Marigold. The next afternoon, the doorbell rang. Elowen opened the door expecting Hattie, perhaps with more cookies, and instead she found Kilani Thorne standing on her porch in a camel-colored coat and high black boots, holding a manila folder. "Mrs. Vance," Kilani said, her smile professional and thin, "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I wanted to talk to you about your well-being." "My well-being?" Elowen repeated flatly. "There has been some concern in the community. About the cat, about certain statements you have been making. I have here some documents from a wonderful senior care facility in White Plains, and I thought we might sit down together and discuss your options." Elowen looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then she stepped back, gripped the door, and said in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "Miss Thorne, my cat is in the hospital. My sister has been gone for many years, and I have just sold the last thing my husband ever gave me to pay a bill. I do not have the energy today to be insulted on my own porch. Please leave." She closed the door before Kaylani could answer. She leaned her back against the wood and slid slowly down until she was sitting on the floor. She did not cry. She had cried enough in 4 years to fill the Hudson. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small slip of paper she had found tucked deep inside the leather harness when she had cleaned it that morning. She had not unfolded it yet. Her hands had not been ready. She unfolded it now. The handwriting was faint but familiar, and it stopped her breath. It said only this: "Forgive him. He has been waiting for you. M." The paper trembled in her hand. The initial at the bottom was a single curved letter, the way Marigold had always signed her notes. But Marigold had been gone for years, hadn't she? Balthazar came home from the clinic 10 days later, thinner still, but breathing more easily, and Elowen carried him through the front door, wrapped in the blue wool blanket, as carefully as if he were made of porcelain. She set him down on the rug in front of the radiator, and he looked up at her with those steady, honey eyes, and she sat down beside him on the floor and stroked his head until both of them fell asleep there. She did not show him the note. Not yet. She was not ready to speak it aloud. But Balthazar, in the way of cats who have decided what must happen next, was already making his own plans. The morning he was strong enough to walk steadily, he went to the front door and sat in front of it. Elowen looked up from her tea. He stared at the door. He looked back at her. He looked at the door again. The message was unmistakable. "Balthazar, sweetheart, it is freezing out there. You have been so sick." He stood up, walked to the front hall, took the strap of his harness in his teeth where it lay coiled on the side table, and dragged it back to the door. He dropped it. He looked at her. He looked at the door. Elowen sat very still in her armchair. Then she set down her teacup, walked to the closet, and put on her heavy grey coat and her warmest scarf. She picked up the harness with reverent hands and fastened it around his chest. She clipped on the long leash she had bought at the hardware store the previous week. She opened the door. Balthazar stepped out into the snow and looked at her once, as if to say finally, and then he began to walk. She followed him slowly. He moved with the deliberation of a creature who knew exactly where he was going. He led her down Birch Street, around the corner past the bakery, whose windows steamed with the warmth of fresh sourdough loaves, past the small library where she had brought Marigold every Saturday morning when they were girls, past the War Memorial in the town square. He paused only twice to rest, sitting down in the snow with great dignity and looking up at her as if to assure her that this delay was a planned part of the route. At last they reached the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the woods began. A narrow gravel path, mostly hidden by drifts, wound between the bare oaks. At the end of it stood a small wooden workshop with a tin roof and a single chimney puffing white smoke into the grey sky. Balthazar walked up to the door and sat down. Then he turned and looked at Elowen. Her hand trembled on the leash. She had not stood in front of this door in over 30 years. The wood was the same, weathered now, grey as ash. The brass knocker, shaped like a violin scroll, was the same. Even the smell from within, faint cedar and beeswax and warm varnish, was the same. The years between then and now seemed to fold like an old letter pressed flat in a book. She raised her hand and knocked. There was a long silence. Then footsteps, slow and careful. The door opened a crack, and a single eye, pale blue and rimmed with white lashes, looked out at her. The eye widened. The door opened the rest of the way. Thalison Crane stood in the doorway. He was older than she remembered, much older, his white hair pulled back into a loose tail, his hands stained with the dark patina of a lifetime spent working wood. He wore a leather apron over a wool sweater. He looked at her without speaking. Then his gaze dropped to the cat at her feet, and a small, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Ah," he said quietly, "he brought you." "I knew he would, eventually." Elowen's throat tightened. "He's been here? All this time?" "Not all this time, but part of it. Come in, Elowen. It is too cold to talk on the porch." She hesitated only a moment, then stepped inside. The workshop was warmer than she expected, lit by a small wood stove and several oil lamps. Half-finished instruments hung from the rafters, violins and mandolins, and one small lap harp with its strings still uncoiled. The smell of varnish and pine wrapped around her like a remembered song. Balthazar walked confidently across the wooden floor and jumped with effort onto a low workbench. He sat down on a particular spot, very deliberately, and looked at Thalison. "He has been doing that every time he visits," Thalison said softly. "He sits exactly there, right above the loose board.